Part 2. This is a continuation of the story. The link to the first part is in the description of this video. Enjoy watching. In the days that followed, I met with casualty assistance officers at our dining room table to discuss the logistics surrounding her death. Though we had grown estranged, they focused on their mission without prying into our personal lives. We prepared for the funeral, which took hours. The body would soon arrive at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Finally, they finished. Captain Sheen looked at me. "Your wife was young to be a major," he said. I nodded. They had promoted her early due to her talent, recognizing her abilities from the start. A younger officer, the first lieutenant, said, "We're so sorry for your loss, sir." I nodded, grateful for their condolences. After they left, I sat alone at the table, reflecting on the sudden separation right before deployment. Her loss cast a shadow over everything. There would be no divorce or reconciliation. Jill was gone, leaving behind only memories, complicated by her past choices. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. I wondered about her affair, whether it was a fleeting passion or something deeper. Could she truly love two men? She had promised to love only me, but now I felt crushed by the weight of that promise. I was counting on her commitment for life, and it was all gone. ISA and her parents arrived, along with Gil and the girls. We watched the children play quietly, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken emotions. I envied Gil and ISA their love. It reminded me of what I had lost. We talked about the Marines' visit and the decisions I had to make. Occasionally, one of the girls would sit on a parent's lap, tears in her eyes. It was that kind of day. I felt welcomed but somehow distant, as if Jill had rejected me by choosing another path. After an hour of conversation with Gil, the next morning, Jill's body was returned to the country. A sergeant accompanied the body, bringing along a box of her personal effects from Afghanistan and Camp Lejeune. Everything was transferred to me at the funeral home. As I signed the inventory, I noted her belongings, identity tags, her wallet, keys, and a few personal items. One thing caught my eye, a sealed envelope addressed to me. I hesitated, unsure of what it contained. The priest from Merciful God Parish visited to discuss the funeral, joined by Kennison and ISA. Arrangements were made quickly. Father asked if anyone from the family would like to say a few words at the service. It wasn't necessary, but many families often chose to do so. Knowing the Kennisons well, he seemed surprised when they opted to remain silent, but no explanation was given. He looked at me, but I didn't elaborate. "I don't think any of us want to speak, Father," I said, keeping my tone steady. He met my gaze and, seeing the pain in my eyes, simply replied, "As you wish." I will speak of Jill as I knew her. We all nodded in agreement. At the gravesite, he offered anyone the chance to share memories. I glanced at ISA and Kennison. "No problem, Father," I confirmed. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken feelings. As we walked to the door, he remarked, "You know, confession can be a wonderful time to talk in confidence." "Thank you, Father." "I may take you up on that," I replied, shaking his hand as he left with a nod to Kennison. I texted Emo, "Funeral day after tomorrow in Sky Gray. Thanks for handling things with work." "You're welcome," she responded. "Wish things were different." Since the unit was still in Afghanistan, only a few Marine representatives were present at the visitation and funeral, along with some local reservists and an honor guard. Sudden deaths often meant funerals without complete closure, and this service was tearful and somber. Father shared heartfelt stories about Jill, her athleticism, intelligence, leadership, and her service to the country. He spoke of her fighting against evil, and while I appreciated his good intentions, I knew he spoke from a place of ignorance. After the service, we made our way to the Catholic cemetery in Sky Gray. The morning was pleasant, and there was an honor guard present. I walked with ISA, Gil, and the girls, while Mom and Dad Kennison led the way in front of us, their presence a gesture of respect. As we entered the cemetery, I was surprised to see Sharon and Emo standing off to the side, searching for me. "ISA, there are some people I'd like you to meet," I said. "Oh, okay," she replied. "Stay with me, girls," Gil instructed, as they looked stunned by the whole sad occasion. ISA, and I stepped out of line, and when Sharon and Emo saw me, I said, "I didn't expect you here." I grasped Sharon's hand with my right and Emo's with my left. It was the first time I had touched him. ISA, this is Sharon, who owns my company, and this is Maureen Murray, another editor I work with. Ladies, this is my sister-in-law, ISA, Jill's sister. Hello, ISA said, smiling. We're so glad to meet you. Call talks about you. Are you Maureen or Emo? She asked, shaking ISA's hand. They exchanged glances, and I wondered if ISA had been curious about Emo for some time. We hope you'll come to the house after this, ISA said. Sharon and Emo nodded in agreement. Of course, we're so sorry, Sharon said, and Emo nodded. I wondered what ISA was thinking. I caught her giving Emo another look. We should get going, I said. Please walk with us. They nodded, and we joined the long line of mourners gathered at the gravesite. A ceremony was to take place, with folding chairs set up for the family under a canopy, so I took a seat with the Kennisons. There was a speaker system, and a few prayers were murmured. At one point, a Marine captain who had served with Jill spoke fondly of her, followed by a friend from college sharing memories. It felt a bit strange that no family members spoke, but that was how it was. After a pause, I was surprised when little Emo stepped up to the microphone. ISA looked at me with a curious expression as Father lowered the microphone for her. She smiled in thanks, despite the heat. I'm Maureen Murray, she began. I only met Jill twice, but I had the good fortune to work with her husband for several years. I can attest to his love for her. She paused, looking around the crowd before continuing. In the 1600s, a poet named Bradstreet wrote a beautiful piece about the love between a husband and wife. It begins, if ever two were one, then surely we. I think that was Kyle's sentiment. She stopped, looking directly at me as she said, this is called Surely We and is meant to be sung a cappella. I recognized the poem, but I didn't know the song. Emo's mention felt significant. It spoke to the unity of marriage and the profound love shared between partners. As she sang, I felt a deep connection to her words. Emo seemed to convey what she hoped to see in me, encouraging me to embrace the love I had for Jill, despite her choices. Emo's voice was surprisingly strong. I stood, feeling ISA's eyes on me, and remembered something I'd said about Bradstreet. Her virtue is flawless, she loves, and nothing can curtail its nobility. Emo didn't want a man who didn't love his wife. A tear escaped my eye. I still loved Jill, and there was no shame in that. Emo's voice was pure, almost holy, and by the time she finished, the audience seemed eager for more. Thank you for indulging me, she said gently, returning to stand with Sharon, who smiled and patted her on the back. I had no idea she was such a talented singer. Her voice was enchanting and confident, a stark contrast to her speaking voice. As Father returned to the microphone, he nodded toward Emo and said, "Wonderful." An honor guard fired 3 blank shots, and I cringed. The funeral drew a large crowd, and many gathered at the gravesite. I noticed Mrs. Deo among some military men and exchanged a nod of commiseration with her. As we sat, the Marines began the ceremonial folding of the flag from Jill's coffin. One with many stripes came over, holding the flag tightly folded into a triangle. He presented it to me, saying, "On behalf of the President of the United States, the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." I took the flag with both hands, replying, "Thank you." I didn't comment on his words about honor and faithfulness. He stood, saluted, and left. The moment felt suspended in time, and I took advantage of the quiet that followed. I stood and stepped in front of Jill's mother, going to one knee and holding out the flag. "You must know I always thought of you as the mother I hoped Jill would be. You were a perfect role model. You should have this." She gave her life for her country, and her love for you is undeniable. I leaned forward, kissed her cheek, and placed the flag in her lap. She rested her hand on it, and in that moment, I realized I was drawing attention. I didn't care. The priest was waiting for me, so I returned to my seat. Dan Kennison put his arm around me and said, "Kyle, you're the son we didn't have." I looked into his eyes, saw his sincerity, and accepted his honesty. A moment later, as prayers began, I sensed the Kennisons didn't fully grasp what had just happened. Many in the crowd likely did. I knew I had to leave. I had things to do. As the ceremony concluded, people stood, unsure of how to proceed. A woman approached us, standing before my mother. "I'm Marge Deo, Colonel Deo's wife," she said. "I was hoping to speak to Kyle. I saw him leave right after he gave you the flag. Is there anything I can do to help?" My mother shook her head, not wanting to engage with Mrs. Deo. Gil squeezed my hand, offering comfort. I decided to respond on behalf of the family. "No, thank you. There's nothing to be done. We don't know where Kyle went." I couldn't help but wonder if she knew about the affair, if she was ignoring it, or if it simply didn't matter to her. We were gathering at my parents' home in a few minutes, limited to extended family and a few close friends. Jill's friends might have been confused. We were usually known for our hospitality, but today felt different. We were polite to Mrs. Deo, offering no invitation to our gathering. The atmosphere was solemn as relatives began to arrive. My parents were present, but later, my dad mentioned that Mom had experienced some anxiety and needed a moment to rest. He stayed with her for about 15 minutes, and when they returned, I found some comfort in the company of my colleagues. They knew some details of the estrangement and were genuinely concerned about my well-being. Gil discovered that both women had doctorates in literature, which was unexpected. I heard him laughing across the room, his laughter a welcome sound on such a somber day. Later, I approached Morin. "Your voice was as pure and lovely as ever, and the song was so touching," I told her. She smiled, responding, "Thank you, Dr. Gilstrap. You and I actually almost met once before." "Oh?" I said, curious. "I was there the day you were awarded at UNCC 8 years ago," she explained. "One of your papers had just been published, and you were on stage while I was in the audience." I laughed, thinking of the coincidence. "If you don't mind me asking, how old are you?" I queried. 30, she replied. Gil shook his head, smiling. "You're a remarkable person, Dr. Murray. How did I not know you had a PhD?" I asked. She said, "Kyle tries not to notice me sometimes." Her words were peculiar, yet intriguing. I wondered about the nature of their relationship. "Do you think she and Kyle have something going on?" I asked. "No, I think they kept it strictly professional," Gil said, but his expression suggested otherwise. I sensed Morin's fondness for Kyle. She was open about her feelings, and it seemed she wanted us to know. Gil smiled, seemingly aware of it too. I liked Morin and appreciated her presence. We invited Sharon and Morin to dinner with us, and I think Morin wanted to stay, but they declined to head to the airport. I did get their email addresses. Emo is the one to contact. Dr. Akrian said she and C work together on everything. He contacts her often, more than daily. She looked at me strangely, as if there were more to say, but she remained silent. That evening, Kyle called. "Hello, Gil," I yelled. "Kyle's on the phone." Gil came into the room and put him on speaker. "Gil's with me," she said. "The girls are gone for the evening." I heard Kyle's nasal breathing. He was always a noisy breather. His nose had been hit several times playing baseball and football. One otolaryngologist even asked him how many times he had broken it. Kyle just laughed. He never went to the doctor for missing baseball. He cried and complained as a kid but just played on. "Hello, Kyle, we're here." "You're one of us, man," Gil said. "Thanks," Kyle replied. "Quite a funeral, wasn't it?" "Yes," I answered, looking at Gil. "We enjoyed meeting your two friends from work, Dr. Oren and Dr. Murray." "I had no idea she could sing," Kyle said, and I thought he might be smiling. "It was quite a performance," Gil nodded. "She seemed to be singing to you," I thought. "I had that impression too," I agreed. "I just couldn't face everyone," Kyle admitted. There was a pause before he continued, the reason I called. Jill left me a letter, and her phone is here, her laptop among her effects." I charged her phone. My heart stopped. I wondered if Jill had foreseen or prepared for her death. Perhaps she'd written everything out, explaining every detail, or saved all those messages I remembered, and perhaps many I'd never seen. Maybe she considered that Kyle would want to know everything, or maybe she'd erased it all to spare his feelings. Would it be good for us to know every detail? For Kyle, would knowing help or hurt him? Would it be better if he never knew the specifics or if he knew everything? What would help him move on from his beloved's betrayal? Oh, I said. Gil looked at me. Kyle, I think you should read the letter and maybe check the phone or any recordings, he suggested. Let me talk to ISA for a minute before you do anything, okay, bud? There was a deep breath as if Kyle wanted someone to tell him what to do. I muted the phone. Should he know exactly what she did? What if she recorded something inappropriate? I shook my head. How does that help Kyle now? I couldn't imagine Jill doing or saying such things to anyone, but perhaps Kyle needed to know. How does a good wife get to that point with someone not her husband? Humiliation can destroy men. It would destroy me. Gil looked at me, and I met his eyes. God, I love that man. He continued, some men might not want to know, but most, and I think Kyle's one of them, would need to know if they were intimate in this room or another, how they did it, everything. Why they did what they did. It'll still be tough. Kyle was humiliated. He probably thought everyone knew about the affair and felt foolish for not realizing it. Men are different, I guessed. Then I remembered Mrs. Deo approaching us and how I wondered what she knew or didn't. I just don't think anyone would want to go to those depths, I said. Gil shook his head. He needs to understand how deeply he was hurt. You know he's in pain. He's your best friend, and you're his. You both lost the most important person in your lives. I put my hand on his cheek for a moment. He turned his head and kissed my palm. I realized he knew me, knew how I felt about Kyle. He loved me for who I was. I unmuted the phone. Kyle, whatever you decide to do, give me a call afterward, okay? Okay, he said. Would you rather, he started. No, Kyle, it's between you and Jill. Whatever you choose to share is fine, but you should decide what to disclose, I said. Gil nodded. Kyle was quiet and thoughtful before responding. Okay, I'll call back, maybe tonight. Goodbye, both of you. Bye, Kyle, we both said, and I clicked it off. We didn't speak for a long moment. Gil put his arms around me from behind and kissed my neck. You know how Kyle's going to get past this? Gil asked. No, I replied. Is it possible? He smiled. Two things. He's going to finally get mad as any husband would. He already is. It's just hidden beneath his sadness. Maybe knowing more details will bring that out. Okay, I buy that. You said two things? He smiled. He needs someone special in his life. For a second, I thought he was referring to me, but he shook his head. I felt his arms around me again, but he wasn't talking about me. No, not you. I know you both love each other, but you have me, and Kyle would never break that bond. I even doubt you would, he said, teasingly. No, I mean Morin. I felt a pang of jealousy, but then realized she could be part of the solution. Gil had seen it in her too. She looked young, but had a mature love for Kyle. There was something different in how Kyle regarded her, a respect. For years, he had spoken of his friend Emo, and I had assumed Emo was a man. I doubted she was competing for his affection because of the song she'd chosen at the funeral. It seemed she genuinely wished Jill were still alive for Kyle. I thought Kyle kept her at arm's length, avoiding any complications. Gil's head rested on my shoulder. I think Morin cares about him or wants to, I thought. Kyle probably knew how she felt and returned it, as far as a married man should. I wondered how Jill had gotten involved in the affair. Somehow, Kyle had found his next love before the first one failed, managing to stay faithful to both. Morin was a special person. She loved Kyle, and that's not a bad thing at all. She wanted us to know it. Mark Deo narrating. Dwight called around 3 in the morning after the Kennison funeral. I was in Ohio and had missed any chance to speak with Kyle Franklin. I noticed the family hadn't invited me to their gathering. I was now convinced they were avoiding something about me. I wondered if they blamed Ike or the Marines for Jill's loss, But that didn't match the fact that Kyle had lost contact with us before her death. All my emails were ignored. Major Kennison's sister said they weren't upset with the Marines, but I was at a loss to understand it all. Most of Dwight's calls were in the middle of the night because of the time difference. We'd talk about how things were going with his job and past deployments, and we'd even grown close in a way. Dwight would find some alone time, and we'd share personal details. I'd send him pictures. As the regimental commander, it weighed heavily on him, and he needed comfort more than excitement. I went to Major Kennison's funeral. After we finished talking about missing each other and what was going on over there, I mentioned I missed the visitation because I was at another funeral for Lance Corporal Thomas, who was killed alongside her. How'd it go? Dwight asked from overseas. We had all sorts of trouble finding her husband, Kyle Franklin. He went home to Ohio instead of staying in their house on base. I remembered his last name was Franklin. At least I made the funeral. They presented him with the flag, and then he gave it to her mother. I never got to talk to him, I said. I heard Dwight exhale, as if he were holding his breath. He sometimes did that during stressful moments, even while driving. She and I hardly talked once we were in Afghanistan, he said. Why? Too much to do? She did her job well. There was never a supply issue. She knew her stuff, he added. She thought our whole logistics team was top-notch. S4 loved working with her. It took some of the pressure off me. Usually, he wasn't so forthcoming about his team and their situations, Marge remarked. It was as if he wanted to clear something up about Major Kennison. Did you know anything about her home life? He asked abruptly. Yeah, I got a message from Camp Pendleton when she was temporarily assigned there. She needed a procedure. Maybe they were having trouble starting a family or something. I knew what that meant. I was a registered nurse until my husband's career demanded more of my time. We talked about other things, and the episode didn't seem strange until after we hung up. Dwight knew the gossip. He understood his Marines as any good commander would, but usually, it didn't extend beyond their marital status, children, education, and political connections. I was surprised he knew so much about the Major's situation during her temporary assignment across the country. What month was that? He didn't say. He usually forgot things that didn't impact him or the Corps in the long run. Kyle Franklin narrating. I picked up the envelope. Only Kyle was written in large black marker on the bottom. In Jill's small, almost unnoticeable cursive, it read, "Read this first, Kyle, please." I read it aloud, alone in the room. Dear Kyle, I lost the love of my life, you. I am so sorry. You'll never know how much. When you left so abruptly that night, I realized I'd compromised all that was best in me. I can't believe what I did, what I agreed to do, the deceit that became my daily nature. I was less than I had been. I don't know why I just did it. It was as if I were living two lives at once. I have ended all personal interaction with Colonel Deo. I cut it off without explanation. I even wrote my statement down and memorized it. I told him, Colonel, our private relationship must end now. What we did was wrong, and I need to get past my guilt. I'll tell no one of it, and I expect the same of you. He looked relieved. I was just another problem solved before deployment. We'll speak no more of it, Major, at least until we return to the States, he said. He made absolutely no objection. I noticed he hedged his answer. If he ever tried to bring it up, I intended to notify his wife. But that's moot now since you're reading this. I turned and walked away. I will not be alone with him ever. No one knows of our affair, none of the other Marines, not his wife, absolutely no one. Only you, ISA, Gil, and oh my God, Mom and Dad. I saw Mom's eyes when ISA told her. I think of those eyes every day now. I left my phone and computer for you. I was going to erase everything, but I've already manipulated our situation based on my own desires and misguided thoughts. It's up to you what you want to know about my connection with Colonel Deo. By reviewing everything on the phone, you might piece together as much detail as you want. I hope you choose not to look at the recordings on the computer, but it's your choice. Whatever you decide, whether to see everything, some things, or nothing, I hope it brings you peace in the long run. I wish you would erase everything unread and unseen. What happened was wrong, and I didn't consider how it affected us. I love you, not him. I am truly sorry. At least if you're reading this, I won't have to face you again. I changed the passwords on all devices. They are now the same across the board, no spaces, all lowercase. I've hurt the person who loved me the most, and I don't know if it can be fixed. Perhaps things can improve for you, but I feel lost. I loved you. I failed my family, myself, and you. I even let down the Marines. If you can forgive me, Jill. I sat back down. We weren't kids anymore. I stared at her phone. What did I really want to know? What did I need to know? Could I find happiness without knowing? Would the questions keep haunting me? Why couldn't I just mourn and move on? I decided I wanted to know when the affair started, whether the miscarriage was really my child, and why Jill jeopardized our marriage for a moment of passion. How could she allow this to happen? What circumstances led her to betray our trust? When did she lose respect for our relationship? I had always been careful not to get close to anyone else, thinking of the values we shared. I turned on Jill's phone and computer, and fortunately, her password worked on the first try. I saw my mistake when I opened Deo's message, but I had to be careful not to erase anything. She had recordings and videos on her computer in a file titled Only Kyle. I opened her chats and emails, searching for Deo, and found thousands of items. I skimmed through messages that clearly concerned work and some that were ambiguous. I found texts, voice chats, and videos arranged by date. There was a message from a week after Jill joined the unit, filled with work-related exchanges until near the end of the second week. Jill responded to a congratulatory message on her promotion, saying, "What happened can't happen again. Dangerous in many ways." Deo replied, "It was unexpected, wonderful, but never again." I took a breath at what I read and what I didn't. 5 weeks later, a few messages had a different tone. On Christmas Day, while we were at our house, Jill wrote, "It's one thing to believe in principle, another to have so many responsibilities that one mistake can alter everything. I must deal with this, but it isn't me. Deo, it would be better if you went off base. Jill, I'll use a civilian facility. Jill, I have an appointment in LA at 0700 Monday, the procedure would be Tuesday." A few days later, the day before she left for Camp Pendleton, he messaged her, "Deo, I'll arrive at LAX on American Airlines Saturday morning around 1100. Jill asked, "What about March?" Deo replied that he was going to a briefing for regimental commanders at HQ Marine Corps. "I'll drive to RDU and fly to LA, he said. Jill responded, "I'll pick you up, you'll stay until I leave." Of course, there was no more texting for a while. I realized they didn't need to communicate that way anymore. They were together, managing a complicated situation. Discussions about responsibility and valuing life seemed irrelevant. I guessed that a pregnancy would have complicated her deployment and potentially impacted the mission. Her trip to California was to mislead me, and it worked. They relied on my trust. The aftermath of their actions changed their relationship. In the weeks after their encounter, they didn't communicate as openly about it. However, about a month later, after a heart-to-heart in Jill's office, they started to see each other more regularly. Jill wrote, "I can't deny I want you, but we can't make mistakes." They began meeting on Saturday afternoons and Tuesday evenings when he had meetings scheduled, freeing up his nights. He had a room on base, which they used discreetly twice a week, sometimes more often. When Colonel Deo was away for a few days, they had phone conversations that he recorded and sent to her computer. I could hear their voices, which felt awkward. Their texts became increasingly suggestive. I never saw a message about me but read several about the Colonel's physical attributes. They developed their own little language, probably thrilling for them. He once asked her to call him Colonel, and that became part of their dynamic. I watched a video captured on a computer camera. The lighting wasn't great, but it was clear it was Jill and Deo, with their voices audible. They were together in various positions. Later, Deo turned off the camera. There was another video that mostly showed them together as Jill engaged in intimate acts and they talked about upcoming deployments. A week before her leave, Deo said, "I doubt we'll be able to meet in the Middle East. Too much going on, not much privacy. I think we should keep it here." "I love being with you," Jill responded. "But no intimate acts like that. Deo smiled, saying, "That sounds good, but I don't think so. Too risky. So far, no one knows. I don't even think my wife suspects, even after I got caught 2 years ago." There was a moment of silence before Jill asked, "Are you still with her?" He laughed. "Not on those nights. You wear me out." "Are you with your husband?" she inquired. "Yes, but not during the days," he replied. "Have you thought about," he started to ask, and she lifted her head to kiss him gently. It was quiet again for a bit as Jill traced patterns on his chest with her finger. "Does your husband suspect?" he asked. "Kyle? No, not at all. At all, even after everything, he didn't suspect. He trusts me." I could see Deo nodding. Jill continued, "We covered it well." "I'm glad you had it done," he said. "I wish." Jill began but trailed off. A few minutes later, I noticed Jill quietly weeping with Deo's arm around her. After some time, he got up and turned off the camera. There are many kinds of courage, just as there are different forms of loyalty. Perhaps the environment weakened her resolve. We discussed the common language used in the unit. She avoided it herself, but it surrounded her. Maybe she compromised her principles to fit in, or maybe it just happened. "Ah, Jill," he said. "By the end, I didn't know you." "You're mine, Major," he added. "What I've shared with you is different from anything else." "It wasn't just about intimacy," she replied. I stared at the last messages, filled with regret that they would have to stop communicating. The last message she sent was on the Thursday we flew home for her leave. While on the plane, I found it odd that only that one message was visible on her phone. For the first time, I wished Jill were more like ISA. After sitting with my thoughts for a while, I dialed ISA's number. When she answered, I told her about Jill's relationship with Deo and that no one else knew. "I doubt Mrs. Deo knows," she said. "He mentioned it once a few weeks before deployment," I added, but there wasn't much more to say. It was late, so we hung up, and I decided to send a message to AO. She called me back within a minute, and we discussed marriage and disappointment. I felt anger toward the past and the choices made. Some months later, I called Kyle. "Kyle, are you awake?" I asked. He held the phone close, and I could hear his breathing. "Yeah, I am. I'm sober now," he said. "Is there something you should do?" "We really have no connection now. I mean, she's gone. You have Jill and the girls. I have my own challenges." "Good. You okay?" "Mom and Dad worry. They always ask about you." "Yeah, they're great too." "Did you get an invitation?" "Jill's regiment comes home next Friday. They want family, especially of the fallen, to feel welcome." "I think they mean it." "It came in the mail." Kyle was quiet for a moment. "I've seen some emails lately, but I don't pay much attention," he said. "There's a ceremony, a welcome home. I assumed there would be a speech from the colonel, probably short." I hesitated. "Kyle," I said after a minute. "I'll be there," he said decisively. I was surprised. I thought he'd need more time to consider it. It had been months, but the pain of Jill's choices and loss were still hard to swallow. Perhaps he was ready to confront it. Mrs. Deo called me the week before the return. "We will be there," I said. "Mom, Dad, my husband, and our girls." "But Kyle, you know they had issues," she responded. "Yes, I've gathered that." "I don't understand. Did he oppose her deployment?" "That can create strain between spouses." "No, ma'am, it was personal. Look, I'm tired of beating around the bush. Kyle is part of our family, but they had a falling out just before deployment and never reconciled. He's my best friend. I'll talk to him about going, but we won't know until it happens. He told me he would go the other day." Mrs. Deo was quiet for a moment before agreeing, "Yes, I guess I'm sorry." She left so much unresolved before heading overseas. "It's left a bad taste, that's for sure," I said. I called Kyle for days before the homecoming. "Kyle, ISA's on the line. Can she join us?" I asked. I was startled when he asked if she could jump in. I almost said no but then replied, "Yes, please." "Okay, ISA and I are on the line too, Kyle said. Hi, ISA, he said with that little girl's voice. How could she sing so powerfully? I didn't quite understand Emo. Her meek demeanor paired with a sharp edge felt contradictory to my experience. Good to hear from you. Are you going with Kyle to the homecoming? I asked. Gil heard me and smiled, as if to say, really, you ask that? Do you think I should? Emo replied, sounding uncertain. Yeah, why don't you? I have to fly into RDU. Could you pick me up there? You do think it's appropriate, don't you? Of course, Emo said. I feel honored. I was waiting at RDU when Kyle emerged from the restricted area. He smiled, and we hugged, longer than a usual hug. He didn't lift me, but I sensed he considered it. I held his shoulders. We communicated more personally now through chats and voice, but he lived in Columbus and worked for Zinger, so we weren't dating. When or if he was ever ready, I would be willing. It's so good to see you, Emo said. He looked straight into my eyes, longer than before, making me a bit self-conscious yet excited. Good to see you, I replied. He actually held my hand as we walked over to get his bags. He seemed so much more open and cheerful than he was at the funeral, without that deep, dark look of depression. Maybe he was coming out of it. We had plenty of time to talk as I drove us to Jacksonville. He expressed concern about the homecoming of the 6th Marines. This is a role I didn't expect. I'll be the only husband of a deceased member who was a higher-ranking officer. How do I act? Act as you think a good man would. You have no reason at all to feel uncomfortable, I advised. He looked at me, hesitant to bring up her past. Your respect for your marriage shouldn't be diminished by anyone else's actions, even hers. How do I convince him that his wife's choices don't define him? You keep mentioning that Bradstreet poem, he noted. I laughed as we turned toward Jacksonville. Bradstreet was a model for a loving partner. I'm ready to put the whole situation behind me. I want to remember Jill the way she was, not the way she acted in the last 6 months. I nodded. Maybe you'll be able to after the homecoming. Kyle gazed out the window at the scrubby pine trees and seemed lost in thought. We met the Kennison family at the motel. As we unloaded bags from the trunk, I realized I had missed Dan and Penny Kennison at the funeral, as well as their kids. Emo, this is Dan and Penny Kennison, Jill and ISA's parents, Kyle introduced. I stepped forward, and Mrs. Kennison held out her hand. Your song was so beautiful at the grave, she said, shaking my hand. She looked at me awkwardly for a moment before leaning in for a hug. Thank you. I felt nervous. I sing at many weddings, but not many funerals. I wanted that moment to be special for Kyle. You work with Kyle? Dan asked, shaking my hand. I do, although I only see him a few times a year at meetings, I replied. We exchange a lot of emails. Kyle stayed by my side, making sure I didn't feel lost among the Kennisons. He watched over me like a protective sibling. Sometimes I took advantage of that, but at other times, I wanted to assert my independence. We spent the late afternoon at the indoor pool, watching the kids splash around. They weren't quite sure what to make of me. Sometimes they treated me like another child, so I joined in their fun, but at other times, they remembered I was an adult. I wore a one-piece suit that surprisingly flattered me. Kyle enjoyed tossing the girls into the water repeatedly, and I enjoyed my turns as well. Hey, you're really good at this. Have you had practice tossing little ones? I asked, leaning in. He looked at me, puzzled at first, then burst out laughing. I'd never seen him laugh so heartily. ISA was a striking presence, tall, thin, and exuding confidence. She wore a one-piece suit, but Kyle didn't toss her. She contrasted sharply with her shorter husband, yet they seemed genuinely in love and happy. He was the brilliant mathematician devoted to his family, while she was the beautiful wife who brought out the best in him. When I met Jill those few times, I assumed she was the standout in the family. She was attractive, but ISA was in a league of her own. We had a late supper at a local shrimp restaurant and talked for an hour until the little girls began to look sleepy from all the swimming and driving. We returned to the motel, and Kyle walked me to my door. He hesitated for a moment. Emo, we're not starting from scratch, you know. But it's only been 4 months since she passed, 7 since I found out. I kissed my finger and touched it to his lips. I understand. We have time, and her family is your family. They're lovely. The girls are delightful. ISA, Gil, her parents, you have so much love in you. I see why you had such a wonderful youth. My heart broke for all the emotions he must be feeling. I let myself in, and then Penny and Dan rode with Kyle and me to the homecoming the next morning. The Gilstraps arrived in their minivan. We had special passes to get through the gate, and signs directed us to the regimental area. It was my first time on a military base, and I was taken aback by its size. I noticed there were no visible weapons, but we did pass tanks and armored vehicles at the front gate. Kyle explained what we were seeing. The regiment returned to Camp Lejeune 1 battalion at a time, probably as they disembarked from the ship in Moorhead City. Jill's unit, the regiment's headquarters company, arrived on a Friday morning around 11 o'clock, with the remaining battalions returning throughout the afternoon. The crowd stood in the field, held back by tape barriers that could easily be lifted. There was a podium and speaker system facing the crowd, along with an open area for a battalion to stand before being released. A Marine band played off to the side. Trucks had brought the company from the armory a quarter-mile down the street so they could deposit their gear. The crowd was impatient, watching the company hand in their gear and then march toward the field after an interminable wait of 7 months. It turned out to be wise for them to return their gear first. Mrs. Deo gathered the families of the wounded and the fallen near the corner of the tape barrier. "Hello, I'm Marge Deo, Colonel Deo's wife. I'm glad you could come," she said to us. There were about 10 who had been wounded. I need to get everyone's names so I know who I'm speaking to. The way it usually works is the company marches onto the field, the colonel will speak briefly, and then he'll come to each of you wounded and then each family of a fallen Marine, from our left to right. If he gets it out of order, just correct him and point out who is who. She smiled and had us stand at that corner of the field, with the wounded to our left and the families of the fallen to our right. I stood behind Kyle to his right, allowing me to look between Dan and him. It felt like the right position. It would have been awkward introducing a co-worker to the colonel. Mrs. Deo was gracious and warm-hearted. I didn't realize the responsibility an officer's wife assumed with military families, contacting, helping, organizing, counseling. She walked down the line, gathering family names and speaking with everyone. I could tell she made a point of speaking to Kyle. "I'm glad you decided to come, Kyle," she said, extending her hand to him. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, shaking her hand. Kyle looked intently into her eyes. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she added. Kyle nodded. "Thanks." Mrs. Deo stood there for another moment, waiting expectantly, but Kyle said nothing. He continued to look deeply into her eyes, perhaps wanting to know if she was aware, but he didn't find the opportunity. "Well, they should be here any moment." "Again, I'm glad you're here," she said, leaving us just as the first unit marched onto the field. I doubted she had any idea that her husband had been involved with Jill. Kyle was on our left, with Dan and Penny Kennison beside him, then Gil with the girls next to ISA. Colonel Deo spoke briefly to the crowd as their sons stood at ease before them, facing them. There was a palpable anxiety and desire to see their boys, to break through the barrier and embrace them again. Colonel Deo felt it, but he also needed to acknowledge that some had been wounded, some would be permanently affected, and some had not returned home. He spoke clearly, emphasizing sacrifice and honor. On one tragic afternoon 4 months ago, this headquarters company lost 2 members and 6 were injured in action, while more were wounded over the following months. Thankfully, we lost no more from this company. "I would like to greet you who have lost so much," he said, stepping down from the podium to where Mrs. Deo stood with us, shaking hands with the parents and loved ones of the injured, and then turning to us, the families of the fallen. She handed the list to the older Marine who accompanied him. Colonel Deo was very tall, fit, sunburned, and handsome. He towered over most other Marines and overshadowed me, but I doubt he even noticed. He was accompanied by a stocky sergeant major, a man who didn't seem eager to make friends. The colonel did all the talking as he and the sergeant major addressed each family using the list Mrs. Deo compiled. He worked his way down the line from our left to right, speaking to the families, shaking hands, and occasionally hugging a mother, father, or spouse. "So glad Sergeant Wilson is back on his feet, or the Corps stands by its wounded," I heard clearly, but most words were private and likely well meant. It was a serious atmosphere, and several wives, mothers, and fathers were in tears. In most cases, a wounded Marine stood nearby. To our right, a family held an enlarged picture of a son they had lost. The colonel came to Kyle first, the husband of Jill. I saw him clearly. Deo was about 5 or 6 inches taller. The adjutant had the list and identified the family to him. Deo nodded sagely. "Major Kennison's family," the colonel said, looking at the entire group, meeting their eyes. "I'm so sorry for your loss. She was a great Marine, a wonderful person in every way. Major Kennison will forever remain a part of this regiment, this division, this Marine Corps. We will never forget her, nor will we forget her sacrifice." He looked directly into Kyle's eyes. "You are Major Kennison's husband, Kyle, I believe?" "Yes, I am." I watched that big man, knowing the damage he'd done to the Kennison family and the pain he had caused Kyle. I sensed his arrogance and perhaps a hint of victory. I remembered Tolstoy, "Our lives have been joined not by man but by God." That union can only be severed by a crime, and a crime of that nature brings its own consequences. I doubted the colonel was thinking of Anna Karenina, though. She was like my right arm, managing her shop beautifully. Her Marines loved her, and her loss would never fade. Deo continued, "Semper Fidelis," he said seriously, holding out his hand to shake Kyle's. Kyle glanced down at the hand and then back up at the colonel. He acted so quickly that ISA later asked me if he had planned it. Looking into the colonel's eyes, Kyle said very seriously and clearly, "Semper Fi." I don't think the colonel recognized the setup, so when Kyle threw his fist into the colonel's jaw, it laid him out on the grass. All 6 feet plus of him didn't wake for 5 minutes. It broke his jaw, which I gathered had to be wired shut later that afternoon at the hospital. The punch carried Kyle's entire body across the tape barrier and almost onto the colonel. He managed to stay on his feet for another second, but there was a moment of shocked silence. Suddenly, noise and movement erupted everywhere. The sergeant major of the regiment tackled Kyle to the ground at my feet, and several Marines broke ranks to defend their colonel, jumping on Kyle and the sergeant major. People were yelling. I was so small, enclosed and buffeted by the crowd surging forward as if alive. I looked to the right to escape the crush, but they were larger and blocked me. I had no way to move, my feet weren't even on the ground. Through gaps between people, I saw Gil with an arm around each of his girls, gathering them close. Dan, with his arm around Penny, moved toward Gil and the girls. I started to panic as the surge took me away from the Gil straps. Suddenly, I felt a hand grip my arm tightly, pulling me to the right and between two members of the crowd. ISA was pulling me into her family circle. My feet touched the ground again as she gathered me in, saw I was okay, and smiled. Her left arm was around me and her right around her mom, with the girls safe in the middle. My left arm naturally went around Gil, and I put my right around ISA. It was only seconds, but I had never been so scared as when I felt swept away in a crowd. I don't know if she heard me amid the uproar, but I whispered thanks. The crowd surge stopped, with people parting in front to avoid the pile of Marines on top of Kyle. Mrs. Deo stood to our right, stock still, gathering her wits and lifting the yellow tape to reach her husband. She was understandably concerned, and it would take her a few extra seconds as her way was blocked by the pileup. This is a glorious day, ISA exclaimed to me, and I felt it too. The sun was shining, the regiment was home, and it was warm. There was no shame in defending love. I wondered if I'd soon be dating someone with a criminal record. I looked forward to telling my parents about it. I said to ISA, probably not the way Bradstreet would have done it. ISA looked at me and then laughed, and I felt grateful to be understood amid the chaos. I heard remarks from the Marines, like Major Kennison's husband knocked out the colonel with one punch, and from a band member, greatest homecoming ever. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, and Marines still somewhat in ranks were looking back and forth at each other, commenting. I was gently laughing, though tears filled my eyes. Our group hug ended with the danger, but we stood closer together. ISA moved next to Gil, who said, Kyle, you have to love Kyle. ISA leaned her cheek against her husband's head. Then Mrs. Deo made it around the pile of Marines to her husband. She went to her knees beside him, her hand on his hair. A Navy corpsman from the company reached him on the other side and knelt, checking vital signs and gently feeling the colonel's jaw. He seemed to reassure Mrs. Deo. Military police arrived, yelling at the crowd to back up, while sergeants and lieutenants called their men back to ranks. Several platoons were brought to attention by their commanders. Mrs. Deo stroked her husband's bristly hair. His hat was not in sight. MPs pulled the 6th Marines off Kyle now that the commotion was over, and those Marines headed back to their ranks. Gil was nodding and smiling. Dan and Penny weren't quite sure what to do, but ISA had an arm around her mom, who had a satisfied look on her face. Was she glad Kyle hit Deo? I wasn't sure. Dad, ISA said, Mom, take our car if you want to take the girls to the motel, spend the day at the pool, or go shopping. Gil and I will stay with Kyle. She looked over at me, and I nodded. No telling how long he'll be here, might be overnight. Whatever it is, we'll find out. We might need to get him a lawyer. ISA was obviously happy. Dan had Penny by the arm and was all smiles now. Make sure he's all right. It's good to see Kyle back to himself, he said as Gil handed him the keys to their minivan. Mom, Penny said, almost as if she were over her own worries, we'll take care of the girls, don't you worry. Find out what they're going to do about Kyle. We'll love taking care of the girls, we'll find things to do. My parents will like them, I'm sure. This family needed Kyle, he was a good man. The girls were confused by the whole turn of events. Girls, ISA said, we'll talk about Uncle Kyle's bad language later. She was smiling. The girls must have wondered what Uncle Kyle did that was so bad, especially since Mom was smiling about it. ISA continued, we'll talk about it later. Go with your grandparents now, okay? We're going to stay with Uncle Kyle for today. She kissed them, then Grandma and Grandpa led them by hand to the van in the parking lot. ISA looked at me determinedly. We're going to talk about commitment and honor, and always being faithful. They will know when always is. You don't choose when to be virtuous, you try to live up to it every moment. The whole company was called to attention with a snap. Finally, every platoon back in order, every squad sharp and controlled again. Kyle looked a little dazed as 2 men lifted him under the arms and carried him off. The regimental executive officer was running things now, but he couldn't speak long because of the siren that grew louder. Soon an ambulance pulled into the grass nearby. Deo was moaning and coming to consciousness. Marge looked thoughtful as she knelt beside him. I think it dawned on her what Kyle's motivation was. Perhaps she had other hints of the affair. She looked over at Kyle between 2 military policemen and then at ISA, cocking her head as if in question. I saw ISA nod back. Marge put things together, nodding as she ruffled her husband's hair and looked at him, her expression crestfallen. She looked directly at ISA, 25 feet away, shaking her head slightly and said clearly, I didn't know. Kyle was taken to the provost marshal for processing. It wasn't far, so Gil, ISA, and I walked there. We saw them take Kyle around back, but then he disappeared inside. We went in the front, and ISA marched up to a high desk she could barely see over. It might be best if I do the talking, I said, catching up. She smiled. Yeah, probably. Hello, I'm ISA Gilstrap. They just brought my brother-in-law in for processing. We'd like someone to talk to us about how things work, how we can get him a lawyer, things like that. The slim guy working the desk would have been happy to deal with ISA, but he was even happier to deal with me. Processing can take some time, ma'am, but if you'll wait, I'll get someone to come out and help you once we know what's going on. His name is Kyle Franklin, he's a civilian, I said. We'll wait over here. My phone buzzed as I sat down. Emily Sims. Hello, I said. Hi, ISA. The usually cheerful Emily said. Kiss, the video is trending already, 15,000 views. She laughed. I guess people just love to see a colonel get laid out by a short guy. We figured somebody would post it, I thought, a hint of regret in my voice. I don't need to know what happened, but I may be able to help. I know a good lawyer who might be at Camp Lejeune right now. Would you like me to give him your number? I couldn't think of a better way to find a lawyer. This is the one who helped June. I remember his lawyer wrote a book about the case that got a lot of attention. Yeah, Tom Marks. He's great. If anyone can help, he can. I think so too, I said. Yeah, ask him to call me. We're at the Provost Marshal's office right now while Kyle is being processed. Okay, expect his call. He's usually very prompt. Bye. She clicked off. I looked at Gil and Mo to my right. That was Emily Sims, an old friend of ours. I said specifically to Mo she knows a lawyer here and says he's pretty good. She gave him my number. I wouldn't know where to look. I guess having a friend recommend someone is the best we can do. We found seats along the wall, with nothing to say. A few minutes later, a tall, gray-haired Marine general came out from the back. Since we were the only ones waiting, he came right to us. He looked at Mo's and then my left hand, and then addressed me. Mrs. Gilstrap. I stood, as did Mo and Gil. Yes, I just got off the phone with Emily Sims. I'm Tom Marks. His eyes were penetrating and intent, and the laugh lines around them were a surprise. He had a star on each collar. What a coincidence you're here, I said. Yes, I'm Amelia Gilstrap. This is my husband Gil and our friend Morin Murray. Actually, Mo is a co-worker of Kyle's and a close friend. He shook hands with Gil and then Mo, looking at Gil a bit longer than usual and Mo almost piercingly. He nodded and smiled. I hope to prevail upon these good people to let us use a conference room, so if you'd all come back. We followed the tall, energetic General Marks into the back. He spoke to a major and some plainclothes officers, shook their hands, and pointed us to a room. We were soon seated around a table. Marks came in 2 or 3 minutes later with a briefcase. Good, sorry I was so long. I had to change some plans. He then explained the normal procedures. Kyle would probably be held overnight, perhaps kept on base for trial, or it could move to civilian court. He didn't know who would prosecute the case yet or if it would even go to trial. He opened his briefcase and set up a laptop. He found the recordings of Kyle's incident, now at 24,000 views, and played 2 for us. Just watching, I felt uneasy. He stopped one and looked carefully as the colonel said Semper Fidelis. Although we couldn't hear it, it looked damning to me. Marks picked up on my apprehension. Video isn't always as clear as it appears, he said. It can indicate motivation sometimes, but often it confuses things. He looked thoughtful. I'd like to talk to Kyle if you're agreeable. I'll offer to defend Mr. Franklin, it's up to him, of course. Gil, Mo, and I looked at each other, seeing agreement in their eyes. Yes, we'd like you to take the case, I said. At least let Kyle decide. He smiled. Excuse me, I'll notify them not to interrogate Kyle without me there. He left the room for about 5 minutes. He took a seat. Good, they won't question him now, I said. Why? He hit the colonel. We talked for 45 minutes. The general fired one question after another regarding relationships and the affair, even to Mo and Gil. He was not surprised to discover that Gil was Dr. Gilstrap but seemed astounded that Mo was Dr. Murray. He quickly removed the surprise from his expression. Finally, he pushed his chair back and looked relaxed. Mrs. Gilstrap, Dr. Murray, Dr. Gilstrap, it's been a pleasure. I wish it were under different circumstances. I'll go talk to Kyle now. That could take a while, and it's unlikely you'll be able to see him tonight. I advise you to go shopping or swimming. Try to get your mind off things. I'll be in touch tomorrow afternoon at the latest, probably before. He looked around at us, but we were all shaking our heads. We were happy to leave things in his hands. He seemed to understand the situation. He stood, so we did. Well then, I'll go see our guy. He shook hands with each of us, lastly with Mo. I think he had a twinkle in his eye about her. I received a phone call about 9:30 the next morning. I had a towel around me. Gil was on the bed, hoping to watch me dress. Mrs. Gilstrap, a woman asked. Yes, this is Isa Gilstrap, I said. I'm Marie Jett, General Marks's assistant. He's in a meeting, so he can't call you himself, but he said to inform you that Mr. Franklin will be released this afternoon around 3 from the brig. You can find the brig on the map or Google. If you can't pick him up, let us know. You have the general's number? Yes, I do. This is great news. When will we hear about a trial or charges? Maybe by then. They're still discussing the issues, she said. I was in the meeting for a bit, and the prosecutor was not happy to discover there was reason for mitigation. Thank you, Miss Jett, very much, I said as we hung up. Gil was on the bed. The girls were with Mom and Dad eating some rolls in the hotel lobby, and I assumed Mo was in her room. Kyle's being released at 3 this afternoon. They still haven't decided on charges. Good, Gil said. Are we picking him up? Yeah, Gil said, looking at me like he sometimes did when he felt a certain way. You owe me, I said. What do you mean? I'm just a step behind, I said. We should do something about that. He rolled over to the edge of the bed, his head hanging off. I dropped the towel, went over, and straddled him. I felt him where I wanted, but I couldn't resist eventually. I never can. 15 minutes passed quickly. Kyle Franklin narrating an hour or so after we arrived at the Provost building, I was taken into an office where a tall brigadier general stood and introduced himself. He held out his hand, so I shook it. Mr. Franklin, I'm General Tom Marks. Your sister-in-law asked me to represent you. Is that your desire? A general would be my lawyer? Yes, sir, if you will. I assume you know the system. Yes, I've handled many cases in and out of service. I'm a reservist, with a law firm in Washington, D.C., most of the time. How much do you cost? Marks smiled. We'll work it out. I'm actually on duty, so nothing until after you're charged. I nodded. He sat, so I took the other chair in the office. I've seen recordings online, so the actual incident is fairly clear. I spoke to your brother, sister-in-law, and your co-worker, Dr. Murray. I understand the motivation wasn't simple. It wasn't just about the loss of your wife. I need to hear from you why you struck him. I looked into his unwavering eyes, letting time pass. Finally, I said, you know about his affair with Jill? Yes. I'll need to see any evidence you have of that. I nodded. I have recordings, a summary letter from Jill. I guess we could dig up evidence of her abortion. Is everything in your phone? He asked. The videos, the emails, I have her written summary at home. The general looked thoughtful. We may need that, but I'll see after tomorrow. I told him everything in order, as I had rehearsed in my mind so many times when I came home. I just said I couldn't take it anymore, and I struck out. He asked, okay, so did you plan to hit him? Were you trying to create a scene, embarrass him? No. I told Jill before she left for Afghanistan that Semper Fidelis means always faithful, and I don't think it just means regarding the Corps. I think it means always faithful to your virtue, always faithful in your life. When the colonel said it to me, it was as if you were intentionally humiliating me. I'll never fully get over it. Marks was quiet. How serious is your relationship with Dr. Murray? Were you lovers? Are you lovers? Such a relationship undermines your case. I shook my head. No, there are feelings, but we don't even go to lunch alone, maybe twice for work over the years. We didn't touch, never held hands, never kissed. We're serious now, but we still haven't gone on a date, certainly haven't been intimate. She's very special that way. No affair. We're getting closer since Jill died and the separation before that, but Mo knew we were estranged before deployment, and why? He drummed his fingers on the table, then stood up. May I call you Kyle? You may call me Tom or General, whatever is comfortable. Of course, Kyle is fine, I said. An affair between officers in the same command is a major embarrassment to the Marine Corps, especially if it involves a commanding officer. We do not take assault and battery lightly. But I must say, there are many officers and enlisted men who would feel you justified if it had been done in private. But it wasn't, it was public, and that deserves consideration. I'll be in touch with you tomorrow. Thank you, General. I don't expect a miracle. He smiled. I've never delivered a miracle, but I hope I can improve your situation. I'm much like the Gilstraps and Dr. Murray. I'll be getting your phone if you'll release it to me. I need your passwords. I received a note from General Marks the next morning at about 10:15. You will be released from the brig this afternoon. We're still discussing charges. Some hours passed. I actually prayed, and I think I was heard. Franklin, someone called. Yes? You're being released. I understand your lawyer will be in touch. He opened the door for me and motioned down the hall. He handed me a paper. This way, stay with me. He walked quickly. My phone was not among my property. Wallet, keys, and some change were. I signed a paper, everything but the phone. Your lawyer has it. Good. Yes, all here, I said. They may need it for a trial. Could be, he said. Hope not to see you back, Franklin. Thanks, Lance Corporal. I never want to set foot on a Marine base again. A lot of that around here, he said. A door opened, and I saw a tunnel of barbed wire and cyclone fencing. To Gil, ISA, and MO, I walked to them, and we hugged. Mo's hand was on my back, and my hand was on her waist. So how was it? Gil asked. Not a fun place, but no one mistreated anybody, I said. Share a cell with some poor kid who says he just wants out of the Marines, cried all night long. Not exactly gung-ho, Gil said. No, we headed for the car in a nearby parking lot. Mo and I had our arms around each other, and it felt natural. Gil and ISA were holding hands as we followed them to Mo's car. As we got to the car, ISA's phone rang. General Marks? We just picked up Kyle. Yes, that's the one. Okay, we'll see you in a few minutes. He wants to talk to us at the motel. I forgot to ask if Mom and Dad could be there. Good. All I know is that I was released, no word on a trial date or anything. I said we arrived at the motel, and ISA went to the desk to ask if we could use a conference room for an hour. Mom and Dad decided to stay with the napping children. ISA nodded. They didn't need to be reminded of Jill's behavior. Mark strode into the lobby where we were all waiting. General, I've arranged for a meeting room here, ISA pointed to a door. Good, he replied. We filed in and arranged ourselves around the table. Emo was beside me, Mark was on the other side across the table. I don't know how much you know about JAG procedures. There are no defense or prosecution attorneys. Usually, the guy in charge appoints them for each case. When I told him I had been requested and agreed to represent Kyle, he appointed one of my former students as prosecutor. He's good, I convinced him. Well, no need for that. They had no knowledge of the affair between Major Kennison and Colonel Deo. I pulled up one of the videos on a computer screen, and the prosecutor looked surprised. Emo asked, "What do you mean?" He looked surprised. Mark was slow to answer, looking at Emo as if she were fragile. After a moment, he realized the Marine Corps was going to come out of this trial bloodied. Our responsibility is to the best interests of the Corps as well as justice. The affair might, in a sense, make the Corps liable for a divorce. The Corps absolutely condemns affairs of married officers, especially between superiors and subordinates. So what about Kyle? Emo asked. They agreed to drop charges. The commanding general of the 2nd Marine Division is sending his second-in-command to request that Colonel Deo resign immediately or face the loss of his pension if we must convene a court-martial. What about all the publicity? I asked. Won't the press demand something? Mark replied, it may be a problem, but sooner or later it will come out. The colonel doesn't want charges, the headlines are bad now. Gold Star husband clocks colonel was my favorite. There were chuckles. Oh, I forgot, Mark said. You must promise me, Kyle, that you will never set foot on another Marine base of any kind. Kyle smiled. I swear I will never step on a U.S. Marine base again. Mark smiled and nodded. Thanks. What about Marge Deo? ISA asked. I don't know, Mark said. It would be tough to be divorced as a woman at 45. She might think things over for a while. ISA nodded, it was new to her. I guess she's not necessarily in a hurry. Gil and I nodded. Mark looked at his watch. I must go. I have to get to New River so I can get into DC before dark. I hate to fly in the dark, he said. He stood, as did we all, and shook hands first with ISA. You are one of the most remarkable women I've ever seen, Mrs. Gilstrap, and forthright. It's been an honor. He turned to Gil and shook his hand. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to talk. I looked up your papers online last night, and you have some intriguing ideas. Perhaps in the future. Thank you, I hope so, Gil replied. Emo was next. He took her tiny right hand in both his and leaned down to her. I hope you and Kay stay together, you're wonderful and intriguing. I found one of your reviews of a James Jones novel, Real Allegory. We must talk. He shook his head and smiled, she was blushing. Kyle, I think your understanding of the Marines' motto is more profound than most. I may use your story someday if I ever think it appropriate. I'll change the names, of course. Thank you, General, I said. You don't need to change the names. Thank you all, and good night. He turned and left, and it felt as if a driving force had suddenly dissipated. We were speechless for a moment. Kyle Franklin narrating, it became dusk, and we would all head home in the morning. Emo and I decided to walk in the park behind the motel. We felt more alone there, although anyone could look out a motel window and see us. Emo was closer than usual, sometimes her hip would brush against mine, and then I felt her hand slip into mine. Kyle, Emo said, I care about you, you know. Yeah, I replied. I've known for some time. You know I do. Yeah, I've known for some time. She was pensive. What is it? I asked, relinquishing her hand to put my arm around her. I'm not Jill, she said. She'll always be your first love. Yeah, I know, I said. But I want you to be my last. We continued in silence as the evening star appeared, shadows stretching and then fading with the sun's direct rays. I want you, Kyle, but I also want you to forgive her. I want her to be in your past. Why does it matter? I don't want to be compared to her when we're together. I want you to know who is in your arms. We walked now, circling a small pond with ducks quacking. You have to meet my parents, she said. I can't wait. She turned to face me, placing her hands around my neck, which wasn't easy for her. She pulled me down so her lips were near my ear. Love me. I lifted her, as one would lift a child. Some might think that was exactly what I was doing, but I clasped her to me, feeling her small body against mine, and our lips met firmly for the first time. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.